Just about to get started here. Today we're going to have one of our own speakers here. Kyrke is the UNBC Sustainability Manager, recently hired. I'll introduce Kyrke in a second. I just wanted to mention that we're doing two streams today again. We're doing a video stream for those who have a nice broadband connection. We're also doing the old Illuminate stream, which I think works pretty well. You know, you get the slides and you get the audio, if not the video. So feel free online to tune into any of those streams. Now, a little bit of background on Kyrke. Kyrke Gaudreau, as I said, recently hired as the Sustainability Manager here at UNBC. Yeah, shout out. Kyrke has a PhD from Waterloo in social and ecological sustainability, and he's done a lot of work in pretty cool places: Barbados, Senegal, Brazil. Nice. In sustainability assessment, mostly of energy projects, I guess. And he's done some consulting in Ontario, Manitoba, environmental assessment of waste and energy plans. Some strategic planning as well, in terms of developing power systems. And so, Kyrke today is going to be talking about some of his work in Senegal. I'll get him to introduce his title, and I'll hand it over right now.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay, Kyrke.
Can you all hear me clearly? That is yes, thank you. Well, so good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this presentation. This is my first time presenting here at UNBC, so I am a bit nervous, but just bear with me, and I'll bear with you. Today, I'm going to share some stories about my experience in Senegal, and particularly regarding the agricultural and the energy systems down there. The stories they all intertie in with each other, and the hope is that at the end of it, I'll have produced a coherent whole for you. Now, the picture on the right, it's kind of hard to see since it's so bright, but it's called the Mayon Turbo Stove. And this stove was effectively the cornerstone of my research when I began it. And what's special about this stove is that it's a biomass residue gasifier, so it can take things like peanut shells and other agricultural residues, and it can produce syngas from it for use in cooking. This stove that's up in that picture was one that I was asked to build a larger prototype. And unfortunately, I failed miserably at it. If you look at that, you couldn't cook anything with it. It's wildly out of control, and it's not producing, it's not actually a gasifier stove anymore. And it was a bit of a lesson for me because one of the things that I learned while down in Senegal was that anyone can try to be a stove builder, but there are very few people in this world who can build truly improved cook stoves. And I was definitely not one of them. So without further ado, let's jump into the presentation. And I will go to the next slide. So this is just a brief outline of the talk that I would like to give. And effectively, it's going to be centered on 4 different parts. I'm going to begin with an introduction to the research case and provide some basic background to the context of Senegal. Then I'm going to switch gears and very quickly talk about the sustainability assessment framework that I used for my research. I don't want to spend too much time talking about methodology. It's not something I take great pleasure in. I'll then start into a brief discussion about some of the key themes that arose in the research process, and then finish up by providing some recommendations for moving forward. And with that, we begin to the introduction to the case. So this was my original research question, which was effectively, how can burning agricultural residues, particularly peanut shells, help Senegal progress towards sustainability? And I believe there were, and there continue to be, very good reasons for such a question. Generally, the context of improved cook stoves in sub-Saharan Africa is that they are driven by 2 primary issues, those being deforestation due to wood and charcoal production, as well as indoor air pollution. Both of these drivers were important concerns in Senegal. And although I must be honest that my research focused primarily on the deforestation issue. In the next few slides, I'm going to put this rationale into the context of Senegal. But before that, I think it's just important to discuss what improved cook stoves are. So now, for the audience listening who were provided the PowerPoint slides, I must apologize. This slide was originally slide number 27. I pushed it forward just because I thought that it might be important to bring this up earlier on. And the reason that I brought this slide up is that most people oftentimes don't understand what I mean when I say improve cookstoves. I remember sitting down with a funding organization trying to describe my research to them, and in their minds, it turned out about halfway through the talk that they were picturing standard stoves that we use in our kitchens here in Prince George. Or perhaps they might go as far as to think that I was referring to those really nice wood stoves that you might find in a cottage somewhere. This is not the case in Senegal. Many people still cook with 3 stones and a pot put on top of it and wood sticks pushed into the middle. Those are cookstoves. And that's called the 3-stone fire. And it's found all over the world. It's certainly not just in Senegal. Now, the 3-stone fire has been vilified, I would say, since the 1980s when the improved cookstove community started to take shape. In that time, there has been an incredible amount of research, development, black magic, cooked books, fake stoves, shoddy research. There's been a whole world, which I generally call the cook stove world. And the people who operate in this world tend to be incredibly enthusiastic and oftentimes very knowledgeable and experienced in the context that they are. But at the same time, there are far too many people in the improved cook stove world who produce cook stoves in their backyard, don't do sufficient testing, and disseminate it to developing countries. And oftentimes these stoves just either don't get used or they're worse off than the 3-stone fire that they were set to replace. So there's a huge historical context to cook stoves in Senegal. And anyone trying to come in with a new, improved, better stove oftentimes has to deal with the fact that there is a great degree of skepticism towards the improved cook stoves, and I think for some pretty fair reasons. Now, the stove in this picture, it's a little bit difficult to see, but it is a new prototype that Philippe Henry sent me the link to 2 days ago, and I'm going to have to read this because I can't remember. This is a solar grill that uses a Fresnel lens to heat lithium nitrate, and then this allows people to cook apparently for over a whole 24-hour period. I can honestly tell you, I have no idea how this stove works, but it looks like a fascinating piece of technology. Whether it will actually end up having positive impacts in developing countries is something I cannot speak to. But with that, let's go to the general context of cook stoves in Senegal. So in the next 4 slides, I'm going to try to articulate this context a little bit more. To begin with, Senegal is the westernmost country in continental Africa. Its geographical location make it very dry, and drought has been increasing in the past few years. It's difficult to see, but you can see Senegal right there. Right in the middle of it is Gambia. And Gambia follows the river Gambia for about 20 kilometers north and south of the river. And it's one of those examples where colonialism created artificial borders that have no business being there. And the combination of Senegal and Gambia being separated in that way has created tremendous problems, but it's not something that I can go into too much in this presentation. Over 50% of the Senegalese population live in poverty, and many live in extreme poverty. Literacy rates and education levels are both quite low, and those lead to increased cycles of poverty. Gender inequality is also ever present. Girls are generally pulled out of school at an early age to perform household tasks. Women are effectively barred from owning land, and there are many types of employment that they cannot seek. Economically, Senegal is characterized by high structural unemployment and a huge debt load. Every year, in the population of about 14 million people, about 100,000 youth enter the job market, and they wait on average 4 years to find their first job. A large portion of the employment that they can find is highly informal and very precarious. It is largely a social security net that's provided by friends and family and kin. Getting ahead in Senegal is very difficult for small businesses and individuals because there is a tremendous lack of upfront capital. Most of the available credit in the country is locked up in the 5 largest industries, many of which are facing economic troubles of their own. To couple with this, Senegal's population is growing at an estimated 2.5 to 3% per year. And the population has increased from 2 million in the 1960s to around 14 million today. And this population increase exacerbates all the resource degradation problems that I will talk about in the following slides. So regarding modern energy access, the Senegalese electricity system is suffering perhaps its worst crisis ever. It's based largely upon inefficient fossil fuel infrastructure, and the electricity system is both unable to meet demand and is frequently unreliable. In the 5.5 months I was there in the field, we would oftentimes have 8 to 12 hours a day without electricity. And it was very difficult to figure out if you wanted to have electricity during the day or at night. If you had it in the day, you could work. If you had it at night, you could have a fan on and you could sleep. And to be honest, I would have preferred to have it during the night. Now, the cost of importing oil for the electricity system increased from about $400 million US in the year 2000 up to $800 million US in the year 2006. So over a 6-year period, that cost doubled. And currently, the cost of purchasing electricity consumes about half of Senegal's export earnings. So electricity in the country, it is related to a fair number of poverty cycles and a negative feedback loops. And one that I'd like to talk about is just how electricity relates to economic productivity. Currently in Senegal, since the electricity system is so unreliable, there's very little incentive to produce or to purchase capital equipment that requires electricity. So the metal shop that I was working with for the 5.5 months I was there, they wouldn't buy a welder because if they can't use the welder during the day, they just simply can't pay it back and it's not worth their while. So many people ultimately end up using electricity for non-economic purposes, be it charging phones, listening to the radio, watching TV. These things aren't bad uses of electricity, but they don't lead to economic activity. The problem then becomes is that if the government invests in the electrical system and all it gets is people not using it for productive purposes, then there's no economic activity from it and there's no financial justification for them to do it. And furthermore, people then tend to use electricity and are unable to pay their bills, and that becomes a debt load that the government is forced to swallow. So things like that mean that both supply and demand have to increase at the exact same time, and they need to increase in a positive way. And things like that just don't seem to be happening. Now, in terms of traditional energy, Senegal is rapidly overexploiting its resource base. Reliance on wood and charcoal for cooking has worsened deforestation, and the country has lost almost half of its forest cover since the 1960s. With rising world fuel prices, many people cannot afford to cook with liquefied petroleum gas, and wood and charcoal are coming back into the urban areas. And this is accelerating resource depletion. Similar to the energy system, Senegal's agricultural system is also experiencing its own form of crisis. Agriculture in Senegal is dominated by small farmers growing peanut, millet, and sorghum. In general, however, Senegal is dominated by the peanut. It has been the cash crop of choice for decades, and farmers will generally only grow peanuts until soil fertility and yields drop to a point that they're forced to rotate with millet. So when I talk about burning agricultural residues, I'm largely referring to peanut shells, millet husks, and rice hulls, because those are the 3 major forms of residues. Now, despite being largely agrarian, Senegal suffers from tremendous food insecurity, and it imports a significant amount of staple foods, particularly dairy and rice. Unfortunately, a few important factors will worsen food security in the long term, particularly due to the reduced yields farmers are obtaining, as well as the increased cost of staple foods on the world market right now. So right now, the math isn't working out. there are more people who are dealing with increasing food insecurity, and the cost of importing these staple foods keeps increasing year upon year. So, as I began to unpack the context in my field research, which is basically the stories that I've been telling you up until now, I realized that the situation was far more complex than I had originally anticipated. There are a lot of interconnections between a fairly big number of important issues. This slide attempts to show some of these connections. It's a pretty messy slide. I had originally experimented with trying some systems of modeling approaches so I can make the slide really pretty, but I realized that I was missing the point. The point is not to make it look pretty. The point is to show how messy the situation can be. So I want to describe just one complex set of dynamics that helps to show how these factors interrelate with each other. Historically, the government promotion of peanuts in Senegal has led to gender inequality. The government supplied improved seeds and tools only to the men, and this made life worse for the rural women. The reason is that the social contract in Senegal has required women to work on their husbands' fields before they can work on their own fields. And with new seeds and tools, men were able to farm more land and better land, and that left less land and worse land and less time for the women to grow their own food. Now, in the 80s and 90s, Senegal underwent structural adjustment, and with that, the peanut value chain was effectively dismantled. And what that meant is that particularly the wives of poor farmers, they were now allowed to enter into income-generating activities to help supplement their husband's income. And this led to the creation of these weekly markets called lumos, where a woman would sell, whether it's food items, small goods, and would produce income that they could then roll back into the family. And what this ultimately did is that it promoted a sense of more equal power dynamics in the household. At the same time, the resurgence of women's power in the household has led to an increase in religious fundamentalism in the country. And this is in part, as I've been told, that the sense of men being the sole provider in a household is now being threatened when they require their wives to produce income as well. And so men were going through a certain amount of an existential crisis. And so the whole point of the story is that the people who brought about structural adjustment, I think it's pretty fair to say that they really did not consider both the positive and negative impacts of their policies, which were largely economic, on the society and culture of the country. But it is these kind of interrelated dynamics that we need to address if we're starting to talk about sustainability in the region. So what does this mean for my research question? What this ultimately meant was that I couldn't answer the question of burning agricultural residues in Cookstoves if I didn't really focus my research on the broader agricultural and energy system of Senegal. And so basically, I had to increase the unit of analysis and change the type of research I was undertaking. So my revised research approach was both broader and more strategic than I had originally anticipated. But it basically recognizes that peanut shell cookstoves are but one alternative in a broader suite of alternatives for the country. And I think that now's a good time just to take a brief segue into the assessment framework that I used. So the reason I was able to restructure my research question to such a degree is largely because I adopted a research approach that's quite flexible. And the framework I use for my research is called sustainability assessment. This isn't a particularly helpful name because a lot of very different approaches call themselves sustainability assessment. For my purposes here, sustainability assessment refers to a form of integrated environmental assessment and one that generally spans the divide from environmental impact assessments all the way up to strategic environmental assessments. And it is because it straddles this project strategic divide that there is some flexibility in your methodology and in your scope of analysis. The sustainability assessment framework that I use in Senegal is one that I've also used in other consulting and research projects. And most recently, I've been working on a proposed hydro dam on the Nelson River of Manitoba. So this is both a research approach as well as a consulting approach. The principal aim of sustainability assessment as a research approach is basically to unpack and identify the main sustainability criteria in a given case and context. In other words, sustainability assessment tries to help people determine and decide upon what it is that matters most for them. It's about trying to decide what is the good life and how it is that we can reach it. This requires integrating both universal and context-specific ethics. When applying sustainability assessment, energy becomes simply the entry point into the broader context of society. This is because energy is but a means to a social end, and it is those social ends that we need to be most concerned with when we make our choices. And the result is that it is generally the context that matters more than the specific technical characteristics of your energy system. And just for those who are in the more post-normal science approaches, sustainability assessment does fit within the realm of post-normal science, which is generally defined as decision-making where the facts are uncertain, the values are in dispute, the stakes are high, and the decisions are urgent. So as noted in the previous slide, the whole purpose of sustainability assessment is trying to unpack what the relevant criteria should be in a case and context. And to do so, we need to start with some basic categories for sustainability. What I have on the slide are 7 basic categories that my supervisor out at Waterloo developed in the early 2000s. So each of these categories, and I don't want to spend too much time walking through them all because it would take forever, but basically each one needs to be unpacked in terms of themes and then ultimately in terms of criteria. And in general, the sustainability criteria that are most relevant tend to span multiple categories, are irreducible, and cannot be quantified. And this really complicates matters if you're trying to undertake multi-criteria analyses or any type of quantitative assessment, but I think it more accurately describes the reality of the world that I've situated myself in. So one example of this could be concerns related to urban-rural inequality. In Senegal, most agricultural producers are paid an artificially low price for their products. And what that is it's basically an indirect taxation of rural regions for urban benefit. And this inequality has led to an increase in urban migration that increases unemployment, leads to the destruction of peri-urban agricultural systems, and basically overwhelms a municipal capacity to provide services. So what originally starts as a question about equity ends up being also about democratic decision-making, about maintaining your ecological basis, as well as trying to find livelihood opportunities for people. And so trying to decide where specific criteria fit into the categories is never an easy thing. Now, in terms of my research process, I used a case study approach. And the reason I did so is that case studies are basically an empirical inquiry that investigates real-life phenomenon, and oftentimes in a situation where the researcher has no control over events. I was in Senegal, I was taking part in things, but I was not able to structure my research environment in any substantial way. And the case study drew from multiple methods, including document analysis, key informant semi-structured interview, and participant and direct observation. But for the most part, I think dialogue is the word I would use. Talking to people, hearing their stories, and learning about how they saw the world is almost the most important way to decide upon what matters most. And fortunately, that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of methodology. I'm going to jump back to the Senegal case right now. So what I'd like to do is just talk about 3 themes that emerged during the research process. And the first theme, I think, is simply that there seems to be a tremendous need for some breathing room. Effectively, it seems that there's a negative spiral taking place between a combination of several factors, such as population growth, resource exploitation, unemployment problems, and all of these factors tend to reinforce one another, both in the short and long terms. There are also positive feedback or poverty cycles that also need to be dealt with. So one example of this, many people cannot afford the upfront capital cost of buying a small liquefied petroleum gas canister for cooking. And what they ultimately tend to do is buy charcoal on a daily basis because they can afford charcoal each day. But over the course of a month, you have spent far more money buying charcoal than you would have buying LPG. And so people end up spending, like those who are the most poor and the most vulnerable end up spending the most money simply because they don't have upfront capital. So I think something needs to happen to break these cycles and give the country both the time and space to plot out a new strategy. Obviously, this is one of the goals of the international community that is working in Senegal, but I've never seen it as a really articulated strategy. You tend to have a lot of different countries and a lot of different organizations working in the same area. They rarely talk to one another, and they never work in concert. Now, as a caveat, many of these problems can be a question of perspective. It could be that I'm applying a Western lens to this, and I'm seeing what I want to see. And there's actually a book called More People, Less Erosion that deals with some of these misconceptions in sub-Saharan Africa. And for me personally, there's always the question of timing. I arrived in Senegal in early April, which is basically the start of the hot, dry, and hungry season. My first memory of the country is driving away from the airport at 5 a.m. and seeing dried cow carcasses on the side of the road. Had I shown up in early August, I would have seen horses gambling and grass everywhere and life flourishing. And I might have had a different impression of what the country was about. So always trying to keep in mind that as a researcher, I bring my own worldview, and I only saw the country for 5 out of its whole 12-month period. So I didn't see the whole story. But that said, I think that there is some merit to say that there is a need for some breathing room. Now, the second theme that emerged is peanut lock-in. Many of Senegal's agricultural problems seem to start with the peanut. As previously mentioned, peanuts are a focal point in the country, in large part due to years of government and colonial promotion, and the history of peanuts as being the economic engine of Senegal. Despite their integration into the structure of the economy, peanuts are declining in importance, and there are several reasons for that. First, while in the 1960s peanuts accounted for 80% of export earnings, they now account for only 12%, and their importance declines each year. This is in part due to reduced yields, but it's also a result of increased competition with other oil-producing countries, vegetable oil-producing countries, as well as restrictive foreign trade barriers. Europe and the States make it very hard to import peanuts from Senegal. And during the same time period as peanuts have lost importance, Senegal has become increasingly food insecure. And the cost of importing staple foods has increased, as I've already said. Secondly, the production of peanuts is very difficult on the soil. And it often is the case that after farmers grow peanuts for about 3 or 4 years, yields have dropped to a point that they're forced to rotate with millet and sorghum. But this loss of soil fertility has led to the decline of peanuts as well. And finally, because of structural adjustment in the 1980s and 1990s, the peanut value chain was effectively dismantled. And this has meant that farmers aren't able to access fertilizers, improved seeds, as well as find good markets for the peanuts that they produce. So in many regards, I think peanuts are dying in the country. But they're really hard to get rid of. First and foremost, peanuts are deeply embedded in the culture. Almost every Senegalese meal includes peanut products of some form. You can buy peanut soap. Animals are often fed peanut meal. Also, even though there is only a vestigial agricultural value chain left for peanuts, there are no other alternative cash crops that farmers can use that have any value chain whatsoever. So any farmers looking for money to buy food, buy other basic necessities, are forced to sell peanuts. So effectively, it seems that we're stuck with peanuts, and it's a poverty trap. And I think many farmers in Senegal are well aware of the problems with peanuts, but there's just nothing they can do about it at this point. And the third theme that seemed to emerge is that there's actually many drivers of deforestation in the country. And I think that the improved cookstove community tends to only focus on one, and that is the production of wood and charcoal for cooking sources. In my discussions with farmers, NGOs, and other people who were concerned about agriculture in Senegal, it quickly became apparent that soil fertility was dropping to such an extent that farmers were literally abandoning their fields, moving into forest, and clearing the forest to restart agriculture. So effectively what you have is that you have multiple drivers of deforestation, and they both, or at least two in this point, and they both collide around cooking. So you could promote burning agricultural residues in cookstoves as a way to address direct deforestation, but you're basically then removing soil fertility, and you'll end up exacerbating the indirect deforestation, which is through land use change. The only thing that complicates this matter is that these two drivers of deforestation, their magnitudes are unknown. All we know for certain is that charcoal use is increasing in the country, but we can't tell you the extent to which charcoal use is leading to deforestation. Now, the Senegalese government took, I think, the really interesting and innovative step of subsidizing liquefied petroleum gas as a cooking source. This subsidy started in 1988, and it provided a much cleaner burning and easier to cook with fuel, with the intent of reducing forest pressure. But unfortunately, due to a balance of payment problems, in part due to the cost of the electricity system, the subsidy is being phased out. So at this point, I think I've tried to tell a basic set of stories about Senegal, and now what I'm going to try to do is just weave those into 3 recommendations that seem to emerge from my research. Now, these are all big picture ideas, and these recommendations have not been tested on the ground. So take that with the grain of salt that it's worth. But that said, it also did offer me the opportunity to answer my original research question, which was, should we burn residues in cookstoves? And the answer is, I don't think we should. So the NGO that I was working with that was building stoves to burn agricultural residues, I had to tell them at the end of my internship that I didn't believe this was a wise choice. And I think basically this comes down to the question of the different drivers of deforestation. And as noted several times before, it's not just about cutting down trees for fuel wood and charcoal. It's also farmers cutting down forests to restart agriculture. And I think that as long as we provide economic or other incentives to reduce remove residues from fields, I think we do farmers a huge disservice. And there's also, once again, a worldview part of this, in that it's largely a Western industrial mindset that sees agricultural residues as a waste product. In many parts of the world, they are just part of a cycle of agricultural fertility. Now, despite my concerns about burning residues, there are some instances where it just makes sense. In the larger cities, such as Kaolack, where they have centralized processing facilities for peanuts, peanut shells literally just pile up on the outside. And farmers and other people tend to burn peanuts in the fields if they can't compost them. So in situations such as this, where peanuts would otherwise just go to waste, it might make sense to burn the shells for energy purposes. But we need to be very careful that we don't further promote centralized food production or provide economic value towards peanuts if, by contrast, we wish that they should be on the way out. Now, secondly, it seems to me that if there's such interconnections between the agriculture and the energy systems of Senegal, then we should be looking at trying to integrate our decision-making across these two systems. And this is not a novel idea. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations has promoted integrated food energy systems thinking and planning for many years. But I want to talk about one possible avenue for integration, and this is biochar and biocharcoal. Now, I'm no expert in biochar, but people all over the world are researching the potential to use biochar as a soil fertility amendment. Biochar helps soils hold water and nutrients and can improve yields. Now, if you add a binder to biochar, such as sugar or clay, you can effectively produce biocharcoal, which can be used as a replacement for charcoal. So in Senegal, I could buy little briquettes of biocharcoal made with a clay binder. Now, the benefit of biocharcoal is that it can directly replace charcoal production, but not necessarily using agricultural residues as an input. You can basically make biocharcoal from anything. And in Senegal, they would take tifa, which was a weed in the Senegal River, and if they weren't making baskets out of it, they could instead make biocharcoal out of tifa. The other interesting side benefit of biocharcoal or biochar production is that it can be undertaken on a small scale. So the German Development Bank, or the German Development Agency, GIZ, it was promoting biocharcoal production as a means of promoting employment with youth and with women in the energy sector. And so this shows how you can get multiple benefits out of a single system, in this case, trying to produce energy. There are, of course, some open questions regarding the long-term success of biocharcoal. First, the extent to which biocharcoal could feasibly replace charcoal production in Senegal is something that I just don't have the numbers for and haven't been produced up to this point. Secondly, the energy return on biocharcoal is something that I think is largely unknown at this point and is likely very context specific. So it matters if you're using a large-scale centralized facility or if you're burning biocharcoal in small tubs of about 55 gallons. And finally, there's always the cultural aspect as well. The people who I talked to didn't love using biocharcoal as a cooking source. When you use clay as a binder, it tends to fall apart really fast and produce a lot of ash. You can get over this problem if you use sugar as your binding agent, but then you start getting into food for fuel problems. So there's always one of those questions that no matter what you do, there are ways to make the situation far more complex. Now, the question still remains then, what do we do in the short term? If we don't want to burn agricultural residues, if we're rapidly or if we're still overexploiting our wood and if we're still overexploiting our forests for wood and charcoal production, and if biocharcoal and the other alternatives aren't available right now, what do you do in the short term? And this leads me to my final recommendation, which is to talk about liquefied petroleum gas. So for those of you who aren't familiar, and I probably should have mentioned this before, liquefied petroleum gas is effectively propane or butane. So when you go to the store and buy a canister for your barbecue, that's basically LPG. And as I mentioned, in the late 80s, the Senegalese government started to subsidize LPG as a way of giving the forest some reprieve and to reduce charcoal consumption, particularly in the urban areas. Now, the original impetus for the LPG subsidy, which was to reduce forest pressure, is no less relevant today than it was 20 years ago. The only difference is that there's no one to pay for the subsidy today. But I think that this is something where the international community, if it ever wished to work in concert, it could easily promote a subsidy. Almost every village in Senegal has an international organization working with them. And so you could easily, or at least you could feasibly develop supply lines for LPG to get out to every village and be in every city. It's not unfeasible. And the important thing, though, is not to see LPG as a long-term solution. I don't know if it would be 10 years, 15, maybe 30, but the idea is to see it as an energy bridge, as something that just gives us the time to plan out what should come next. And I don't know what will come next, but I think that people there can start thinking about it. And with that, that's the end of my formal presentation. So I struggled a bit trying to figure out which points I should summarize, because I think I've made a few too many, but I will focus on 3 points. In terms of methodology, I think it's important to think of your research approach and to maintain or to be as flexible as you can, because as you start learning about the context in which you're doing research, you'll oftentimes find things that may change or nuance what your original research question should be. And this is something that I certainly struggled with a lot when I was down in Senegal. I didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but I also had to be honest that what I had originally posed was just no longer valid. I could still have gone through with the research, but I think it was far more useful for me to be able to take that step back and look at the question from a broader perspective. But to do so, I needed to have a flexible approach. Second, when I was talking about the LPG subsidy, I think it really brings in the idea of thinking about energy bridges. Oftentimes, when people talk about sustainability, it's seen as a threshold. Is something sustainable or not? And basically, nothing's sustainable. Climates change, infrastructure turns over, people die. This is just the way life goes. I think it makes far more sense to think about bridges and always moving or progressing towards sustainability. So I don't think LPG is a long-term sustainable plan, but I think as a 30-year energy bridge, it might make some sense. And if you approach energy systems always in terms of how it might get you where you want to be, and then once you're there, you can think of where you want to go next, I think it's a very strategic way to think about energy systems planning. And finally, I think this case, and I'm sure the stories that I've told, I think they outline a situation where there's no obvious solution. LPG is not a magic bullet. It's not going to save the world. I'd say that there are different alternatives that may be pursued, and they all have their different risks and opportunities, levels of feasibility, desirability, and fairness. And the issues that they're dealing with are not insignificant. I think many livelihoods depend on the decisions that will be made in Senegal in coming years. So I think ultimately my end message is that difficult choices need to be made, and these choices cannot be made by default, which is generally what we tend to do. The default solution in Senegal will not be positive. But that said, I think there is tremendous hope, and I guess that's my story. Thank you.
Any questions? If you have a question, I'll come up and leave the mic so people at home.
Cam.
I have a question
Okay.
about the peanut market in
Yeah.
Senegal. Is it a domestic market?
It's there's a huge domestic component to it, but they still do export. The government sets the prices of peanuts, and local producers tend to have to sell their peanuts to the centralized processors. But what's been happening recently is that in the city I was in, Kaolack, which is in the more eastern part of Senegal, traders from Mali would come in and buy peanuts and smuggle them out because it was cheaper for them to do so. One of the major issues which I didn't touch on here is that we deal with peanut allergies in the West. In Senegal, I didn't know of anyone who was allergic to peanuts, but there is a toxin on peanuts called aflatoxin. And from what I understand, in periods of drought, it's a mold, I believe, that grows on the peanut, and it produces a toxin. And it's impossible to reduce all traces of it. Depending on the jurisdiction, in the United States, they allow peanuts that have up to 20 parts per million of aflatoxin on it. In Europe, it's 4 parts per million. And the reason these choices were made is that American peanut growers can't produce peanuts with less than 20 parts per million. But so what was originally a fairly strong world market, because of concerns over aflatoxin and other trade barriers, it's made it far harder to sell peanuts or peanut products, such as peanut oil, on the world market.
So the rural farmers who are locked into the peanuts, do they then ship their peanuts to centralized processing somewhere?
Yeah.
And so they don't get necessarily the benefit of the husks at the rural level?
No. Right now they don't, and that's in part because of aflatoxin concerns. The government hasn't allowed small-scale processing of it because at the small scale, people tend to process peanuts using triage. So you basically pick up peanuts one by one and you throw out all the bad ones. And triage can actually be a very successful way to process peanuts, but the government has banned local processors from undertaking that approach. They use other approaches.
Question up here in the back.
So you described a very entrenched dependence, I guess, on charcoal. With the LPG, hypothetical LPG switch, how then would it be ensured that you just weren't creating a new entrenched dependence on a different commodity that is actually, not really local even, so they'd have to be pulling in from somewhere else?
I think that's a very good point. And I guess that's where the hope is, that when you think in terms of energy bridges, so you plan to phase in and phase out LPG as opposed to just phase it in and not plan for the phase out later on. It should only be seen, I think, as a temporary solution. Now, what temporary means, it could be 50, it could be 60 years even. I don't know what the world fuel market will look like, but so I don't have a direct answer for that question other than to say that I think being aware that that's a huge risk can help people plan for that.
As the global carbon economy continues to grow and change, is there any talk about how Senegal could use sequestration of carbon for a financial revenue stream, or if they should be avoiding burning the peanut shells entirely so that they're minimizing their carbon emissions?
There was a lot of interest in using clean development mechanism funding, and so the peanut stove manufacturer I was working for, it was based in Senegal, and it would produce stoves that were then sold in Gambia, and those stoves were in part subsidized by carbon offsets. The problem was that a lot of NGOs in the early 2000s, or up until I think about 2008, had their whole business case based on carbon offsets, and then with the 2008 crisis, that market fell through for them a bit. And the problems I've seen with the carbon offset models with those markets is that you need to have a tremendous amount of upfront capital. Like, I think you have to have, I don't know if it's 1 million or 5 million that you're willing to put up for the auditing process. So generally it's people who have rich banker friends that tend to get carbon offset credits, and it's their rich banker friends that get even richer. In terms of the climate change implications of burning peanut shells, I don't really know if you would consider that carbon neutral or not. I just don't have an answer for that, and I think it depends. Some people claim it is carbon neutral. Other people say it's an awful idea. It just depends.
Any other questions? One over here.
All right, so I'm hearing that you've got a really high local demand for charcoal, and that's probably not going away anytime soon. And you have a very large number of people who are unemployed but know how to grow things. And I was wondering if there's been much of a push towards establishing forest plantations to put those things together into an energy system.
Forest plantations. I think there's been a little bit going towards that. It's largely the German development agency, GIZ, which was formerly GTZ, which has been working on forest plantations. That said, most of the agroforestry research I've seen in Senegal tended to revolve around growing things like moringa, where you could take the leaves and process it because it was high in nutrients. So it was, I think it was largely based upon food production as opposed to energy production options. because food security is also a tremendous concern there. And I think that, and I might be wrong saying this, but I've always had the impression that deforestation is sometimes harder to see, simply because the forest might be further away, particularly if you're buying charcoal. But food security, I think, might hit people a bit faster. I think it's in your face a bit more often, or at least that seemed to be the case where I was.
Okay, we have time maybe for one or two more questions.
Thank you very much. I'm not surprised you came with the conclusion that things are complex there. That is what I expected. Just a comment. Most of the, you said the two drivers or the two factors leading to deforestation, I mean, charcoal use and fuel wood for cooking. There are many reasons why the locals go for that, because they are dense, much denser than other alternative like peanut shells. They can last longer.
Yeah.
We tried to do that when I did a study in Zambia some years ago. It was hard. So that's why that thing is going to continue using fuel or fire, or charcoal, because they have higher heat value and they last longer compared to peanut shells, which I don't know whether somebody did work on heat value, because I think it burns probably so fast.
Yeah.
And then you need to produce a lot of peanut cells to last for a number of hours and so on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're proposing the propane gas and so on, and you hope that the government would subsidize as they used to. Am I correct there? Yeah.
Or that the international community. I mean, in my mind, I remember thinking that if every time you went to Canadian Tire to buy a barbecue canister, if 50 cents of that went towards paying for LPG in Senegal or some other place, you could generate a lot of money to help pay for it.
Okay.
And right now, the amount of money being spent on bringing in improved cook stoves that tend to not be used, if that could be pushed towards LPG instead. I don't think the Senegalese government could afford to keep the subsidy up, which is why they stopped it.
Okay. Yeah, I think they should encourage that, because I'm against using fuel wood or charcoal because of indoor pollution. Because if you analyze the chemical elements coming from those materials, they're deadly, and they should actually they should not depend on charcoal and wood if possible. Yeah, they're not good. Yeah.
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One last question. I sort of wanted to ask you about, you're a guy who studies energy policy and strategic planning. What do you think of the LNG craze here in BC? I think I'll ask you about it afterwards. So.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to answer that question.
Yeah, you bet. Let's have a hand for Kyrke.
Thank you.